Now that we have said Paris Agreement promises to bring about some change, what is the promise of Paris? So here we are looking at the top emitters: US, EU, Japan, and Korea. And the red lines here show business as usual in terms of greenhouse gas emissions in million tons of CO2 equivalent per year. Okay, you can see how that adds up to or more than 40 gigatons per year for the whole world when you add other countries. Nonetheless, you can see here business as usual would basically not change things for the US because of natural gas shift that has happened. This is going into beyond 2020 towards 2025. EU would increase a little bit, and Japan and Korea are there as well. And the promises in terms of the key policies. So here the blue and thin green lines show improved trajectories that depend on key policies, and the key word there is that even those do not deliver none of the improved trajectories deliver Paris Pledge. So this is just the same message we've heard before, that we are talking about 2-degree target, 2 degrees centigrade target with respect to pre-industrial revolution, and saying that's too dangerous, so let's bring it to 1.5. But nothing anybody is doing is headed anywhere below 2 degrees, and it's going to be much above if things continue as usual. Okay, so you can see that the promise made minus 26% to minus 28% relative to 2005. There are criticisms that US, I think Obama administration presented this plan, if I'm not mistaken, to the nationally determined contributions, and it's not even clear where those numbers came from and what assumptions were made in terms of policies and technologies and funding in research and development and so on and so forth. EU minus 40% relative to 1990. So both the baseline is chosen differently to go back further, so that you have a lower baseline. So you are reducing higher amount, minus 40%, from a lower baseline, whereas US is choosing a higher baseline and promising to reduce less. Okay, Japan 26% relative to 2013, a much later baseline, and the Koreans just say it's going to be minus 37% with respect to business as usual, which is up here. So that keeps increasing. So your baseline, your reductions can also accommodate more increases. So it's a kind of a little bit of tricky situation. Okay. Nonetheless, we said Paris is a good idea. It's been going well and promises to be high on the self-reinforcing behaviors and mutual benefits. So here are some targets proposed by India. Emission intensity of GDP to be lowered by 33 to 35% below 2005 levels. As we already said, it's the GDP, emission intensity of GDP. So if GDP keeps growing, your intensity will grow, but each additional unit of GDP is accomplished with a lower carbon footprint. So it's the total emission versus the rate of increase compared to GDP increase. Developing countries have to be allowed this room, considering that rich countries have gotten there by emitting since Industrial Revolution. Power capacity to be 40% non-fossil fuel based. These have huge co-benefits for India anyways, in terms of air quality, water quality, health outcomes, morbidity, mortality, productivity, etc. Okay. Okay, daily adjusted life years lost and so on, the measures for health related to emission and other climate change issues, and also extreme events which are causing huge destruction and damage every year. China, emission intensity of GDP to be below by 60 to 65% the 2005 level, and by 2030. That's a very ambitious, good goal, but it's growing at a very rapid clip as well. Despite COVID, it seems to have already recovered. Peak emissions around 2030. That's another promise. Their emission will peak at 2030 and then they will begin to go down. So there is an absolute promise there as well, in addition to the relative intensity promise. Non-fossil fuels to be 20% of the primary energy consumption by 2030. China is already ahead compared to India, for example, in renewable portfolio. Absolute emissions of the USA, 26 to 28%, as we said already, but it has opted out of Paris Agreement right now, but it can be guaranteed that it's going to be back in Paris Agreement once the smooth transition of power happens in January. EU, we saw already 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. Okay, turning the corner at Paris, what was involved? The flexibility of this pledge and review system helped transform climate diplomacy from gridlock and impotence of the past. So, the pledge and review system basically means you voluntarily pledge. In fact, they were called intended nationally determined contributions before. The intended was dropped and they are just referred to as nationally determined contributions. So India made its own calculations about its own goals for economic growth and so on, and decided to pick these goals. So there is learning that will be involved, and the lessons will be shared, probably, hopefully, with other countries on what worked and what didn't work and what would work better in the future. So the example of World Trade Organization, for example, as we said, started as GATT after World War II in 1948, and this is from World Trade Organization itself, which does its own calculation and says trade would have fallen to this point if protectionism of the 1930s had been repeated and 2/3 of the trade had been wiped out. So they're saying here we are at $16.5 trillion, I'm assuming, and it would be way down here. And WTO claims that it has the ability to contribute to peace around the world. And I would believe it in the sense that lots of the potential conflicts, even for a third world war, may have been reduced because of this globalization of the trade. Everybody's economy depends on everybody else. Of course, there are lots of negative impacts of globalization that social scientists worry about, and even the Trump supporters are often those that have been negatively affected by globalization because they were not retrained to adjust to the global economy. Simplistic analysis, but nonetheless. So the flexibility also shows here cumulative fraction of the total, so going from 0% to 100%, and the rank for various total patents. So you can take a estimate of the investment in R&D, innovation needed to meet the goals on reducing CO2 emissions, which include things like fuel cells, nuclear power, so reactors that are smaller, flexible, safer, and so on. Renewable power, so including solar, wind, I think wave, and so on. Rank order of global emissions spending on energy-related R&D and energy patents. Chart shows that largest countries account for the vast majority of emissions and even higher concentration of efforts to control emissions. Okay, so you can look at the CO2 emissions and investments in clean energy as reflected in energy patents. So that's kind of a good news in the sense, even though emissions are not abating, the funding for innovation of renewables and emission reduction strategies or technologies are high among those high emitters. Okay, technological transformation, as we saw for climate mitigation, is a critical ingredient. So if R&D is supporting it, that's of course great news.